We are creatures of the light. The daytime is our kingdom. But when daylight fades, we scurry inside and shut the door on whatever comes out to play or to slay. But other things inhabit the night, the dark, and one in particular is extraordinarily famous.
I am Dracula.
A creature who destroys all whom he touches. Dracula the terrifying, the feared, who sleeps in the tombs of the dead by day and arises at night to inflict his terror upon the innocent and the unsuspecting.
We need you to go to the east, to the far side of Romania, a land that is home to legendary creatures, lorded over by Count Dracula.
You've got to go to him, and you've got to love him.
But what isn't as well known is why, when Bram Stoker published Dracula, he chose to dedicate it to the then world-famous author who'd chosen this island as his home.
The children of the night. What music they make.
Many authors have turned to writing about terror, some more effectively than others. Peter Benchley brought a whole new dimension to swimming with Jaws. Hitchcock's Psycho is dated now, but in its time it wasn't an ideal pre-bed watch. Time isn't kind to some authors. Their work, which at the time they were written appear new and bold, can now appear tired and jaded. Not so Dracula. After more than 100 years, it can still chill. Its initial setting still grips the imagination. The forests and mountains of Transylvania, no made-up imaginary world this. You can travel there, for goodness sake. It's in Romania. And once there lived in those mountains a man who chose to slaughter his beaten enemies by driving a stake up through their bodies and watching them die. Oh, did I warn you? This programme is not for the faint-hearted.
As I leaned from the window, my eye was caught by something moving, a story below me, and somewhat to my left, where I imagined from the lie of the rooms that the windows of the Count's own room would look out. The window at which I stood was tall and deep, stone-mullioned, and though weather-worn was still complete, but it was evidently many a day since the case had been there. I drew back behind the stonework and looked carefully out. What I saw was the Count's head coming out from the window. I did not see the face, but I knew the man by the neck and the movement of his back and arms. In any case, I could not mistake the hands which I had had so many opportunities of studying. I was at first interested and somewhat amused, for it's wonderful how small a matter will interest and amuse a man when he is a prisoner. But my very feelings changed to repulsion and terror when I saw the whole man slowly emerge from the window and begin to crawl down the castle wall over that dreadful abyss, face down with his cloak spreading out around him like great wings. At first I could not believe my eyes. I thought it was some trick of the moonlight, some weird effect of shadow, but I kept looking, and it could be no delusion. I saw the fingers and toes grasp at the corners of the stones, worn clear of the mortar by the stress of years, and by thus using every projection and inequality, move downwards with considerable speed, just as a lizard moves along a wall.
That image of a man, a creature who could slither down vertical walls and who drank blood. But what ties this to an island, to our island? Well, on the frontispiece to the book, which was published in May the 27th, 1897, appears these words, "To my dear friend Homby Beg." Homby Beg, little Tommy, the childhood nickname of Thomas Hall Caine, who came to live here in Greeba Castle, and who, in his time, was the most famous author of his era. Now his books are seldom read. But did he help Bram Abraham Stoker conceive the ghastly being that was Dracula? This from an account of Bram Stoker's life. Bram had been fascinated by stories of ghosts and legends he'd heard as he grew up in Ireland, and maintained his fascination into manhood, where he read more about the occult, the strange, and the uncanny. He pondered and discussed such things with Thomas Hall Caine and Henry Irving in their all-night conversations, which lasted until the edge of the blinds became etched with the rays of dawn. Dracula is a story set for Bran and his readers in what was in effect the modern world. But did an experience that Hall Caine had strike deep into Stoker's mind during those conversations, add coals to the fire that was to become Dracula? You make up your minds. Of course, there have been more than 200 films about Dracula through the years, right back to the original Nosferatu, with its black and white fiend darting from shadow, to Frank Langella's charming seducer.
I am the last of my kind, descended from a conquering race. But I must warn you to take good care. If at any time my company does not please you, you will have only yourself to blame.
Frank Langella, who years later was nominated for an Oscar for his role in the Frost-Nixon interview. If you're of that era, please watch it. Dracula, the charmer, the seducer. But the man who gave his name to Bram Stoker's cold-blooded vampire was altogether different, but arguably many, many times more cruel. His name was Vlad Tepes, the voivode of Wallachia, the ruler of Wallachia just to the south of Hungary. One time hostage of Sultan Mehmet II, the man who in 1453 attacked and took Constantinople, something that had been tried 23 times before, all ending in failure, Mehmet expected obedience from his vassal Drac Tepes, which means, incidentally, impaler. In the event, he found himself in a bloody and costly war. When envoys to Vlad's court arrived from Mehmet wearing their turbans and refused to take them off because it was a Turkish tradition, Vlad had the turbans nailed to the envoy's head. Dracula was forced to retreat ahead of Mehmed's military superiority when war broke out, but carried out a guerrilla war that accounted for thousands of Mehmed's enormous army. When Mehmed eventually reached the Wallachian capital, Togravishta, he expected a siege. In the event, the city was virtually deserted and Vlad had gone. But what Vlad had left behind defies description. But here goes. Over 24,000 Turkish prisoners had been impaled through their bodies on tall stakes in a field outside the capital. I'll leave you to imagine the logistics of how that was done. What kind of man was Hall Caine? A magazine of the time describes him as slightly built, rather under what is called medium height. Hair, moustache and pointed beard are of bright brown, with a lofty forehead and keen, humorous eyes. He would give you the impression of being a man of great ability, even if his name and real personality was unknown to you. Many people remarked that in appearance he was not unlike William Shakespeare. Yes, look at that famous and rare portrait of the bard and you'll see what is meant. But this note was added. Knowing he was an astute egotist, many commentators reckoned he deliberately cultivated the likeness. Hall Caine first met Bram Stoker on December the 30th, 1878. The writing of Dracula was some way distant. It happened in 1897. It was through Caine's growing familiarity and friendship with key figures in the literary world and the arts world, foremost being Henry Irving and Daniel Gabriel Rossetti. Caine and Stoker. It was a case of Hall Chalk Caine and Bram Cheese Stoker. Physically, there was no comparison between the two. There's a picture of them on our Facebook page. Yes, there they are. Stoker, burly, almost menacing. Yes, menacing. Caine, slight, elven. But there was a chord struck from the moment they met, until the day of Stoker's early death in 1912. But where did Stoker get the idea of Dracula? Was there anything that he heard from Hall Caine and the Manx experiences that prompted him in that direction? Perhaps. Hall Caine started life in Liverpool. His father was Manx. After a while, he found his way to the Isle of Man, where he stayed and built a good relationship with his grandmother.
The thatched cottage in Ballaugh was the home of my grandmother as well as my uncle, and I remember her almost entirely, for she died when I was still a child, as the source of certain superstitious beliefs which, to this hour, I find it impossible to shake off. She was a little Manx woman, very old and much bent, dressed in the blue homespun of the island, and occupied with the light labours of the household, while the lustier members of the family were at work in the fields. I see her in my mind's eye, yet gathering up the dry gauze that lay about the stackyard, then feeding the fire under the oven pot that hung from the slurry, a long iron rod and hook over the open hearth. She called me Hommybeg, which was Manx for Little Tommy, and I think I must have been much in her company, for I have the clearest memory of countless stories she told me of fairies and witches and witch doctors and the evil eye. One of her stories was of a troop of fairies who chased her home on a moonlight night when she was just a girl. They were merry little fellows wearing cocked hats and velvet jackets, and they kept prancing and dancing about her as she ran in frantic terror along the lonely road until she came within sight of the lighted window of her mother's house on the Curragh, the marshy meadowland, and then suddenly disappeared. Some of them were malignant as well as mischievous, and she'd seen them flitting along with lanterns the night after a storm to the door of some lone woman whose man was a fisherman, away at the herrings, and was afterwards found to be lost at sea. There were good fairies too, and one of these, whose name was Finodry, would come to poor people's houses at night, when everyone was asleep, and card the wool for the women, and churn the milk for the girls. You had to be kind to Finodry, though, or he might become angry, or even spiteful. So last thing at night, before going to bed, my grandmother would lay out on the kitchen table a crock of fresh water with perhaps a bowl of new milk, and a plate of bonnog, which was barley bread. I remember to have seen her do it.
After being warned by just about everybody in Transylvania not to go to visit the Count, our hero, Jonathan Harker, sets off into the dark.
Far off in the distance from the mountains on each side of us began a louder and a sharper howling, that of wolves, which affected both the horses and myself in the same way, for I was minded to jump from the caleche and run, lest they reared again and plunged madly, so that the driver had to use all his great strength to keep them from bolting. In a few minutes, however, my own ears got accustomed to the sound, and the horses so far became quiet that the driver was able to descend and to stand before them. He petted and soothed them, and whispered something in their ears, as I have heard of horse tamers doing, and with quite extraordinary effect, for under his caresses they became quite manageable, Again, though still, they trembled. The driver again took his seat and, shaking his reins, started off at a great pace. This time, after going to the far side of the pass, he suddenly turned down a narrow roadway which ran sharply to the right. Soon we were hemmed in with trees, which in places arched right over the roadway till we passed us through a tunnel, and again great frowning rocks guarded us boldly on either side. Though we were in shelter, we could hear the rising wind, for it moaned and whistled through the rocks, and the branches of the trees crashed together as we swept along. It grew colder and colder still, and fine powdery snow began to fall, so that soon we and all around us were covered with a white blanket. The keen wind still carried the howling of the dogs, though this grew fainter as we went on our way. The baying of the wolves sounded nearer and nearer, as though they were closing round on us from every side. I grew dreadfully afraid, and the horses shared my fear, but the driver was not in the least disturbed. He kept turning his head to left and right, but I could not see anything through the darkness.
So Jonathan Harker prepares to meet his new employer, an accountant meeting account, who is offering something in the property market young Harker can get his teeth into, before the Count returns the compliment. Being young and enthusiastic, the thought of not keeping his appointment despite the chilling journey the wolves et al. Doesn't seem to have crossed young Harker's mind. But then he didn't know who or what was waiting for him. Did Bram Stoker and Hall Caine talk about the concept of a man whose sustenance comes in B-positive flavour? But then the island also has a creature on offer that was, on the face of it, considerably more dangerous than a 400-year-old man in a castle whose excursions were only possible at night. No, the island had the Buggane.
There once was a woman living near Glen May, and she was the wife of a decent, quiet, striving man of the place. There was no one but herself and the man, and they had a nice little cottage and owned a bit of a croft in which they grazed a cow and a few sheep and grew enough spuds to do them through the winter. And the man had a yawl, and he went to the fishing when things were slack on the land. But for all that, they were not comfortable. For work as hard as the man might at his farming and his fishing, he was kept as poor as Lazarus by a lazy wife. For the woman was fonder of lying in bed in the morning than sitting at the milking stool. Indeed, the neighbours had it to say that she wore out more blankets than shoes. Many a day a man would be going out early as hungry as a hawk, without a bite or a sup in him. One morning when he came in from work, there was no fire at all, as the wife was never up. Well, my poor man had nothing for it but to get his own breakfast ready and go back out to his work. When he came in for dinner, it happened again as it had happened for breakfast. Bad luck to her laziness, he thought. This is cold comfort for a poor man, but I'll play a trick on her for it. And with that, he fetched a bart of straw and bunged the two windows of his house, and then he went back out to his work. The sun had not yet set when he came home in the evening, and his wife was lying in bed waiting for day. "Ah, woman," he shouted, "make haste! Get up to see the sun set in the west." Up jumped the wife and ran to the door just as the sun was going down, and the sight terrified her. The whole sky looked like fire, and she thought that the end of the world had come. But next morning It all happened as it had happened before, and himself said to her, "Kitty, it's the began. Sure enough that'll be having thee one of these days if you don't mend thy ways." "What began?" she said. "Ask me no questions," he said, "and I'll tell you no lies. But it's the big, black, hairy fella that lies under the spoot vor that I'm meaning." "Oh, howl your tongue, man. Thou don't be freaking me out with thy begans," shouted the woman. In the evening, the man left the house to go fishing. As soon as he'd gone, the woman took a notion in her head to bake, as she had only the heel of the loaf left for breakfast. Now themselves can't stand lazy ways, and baking after sunset is the one thing they won't abide. She who does will so meet their revenge. Something is sure to be taken by them, but seldom worse than some of the livestock. Well, the woman set to work to bake some barley bread and flour cake. First, she went out to get gorse to put under the griddle, slipping the bolt on the door as she came in, so that none of the nosy neighbours would catch her and cry shame on her for baking after sunset. She got some meal out of the barrel and put it on a round table and put salt and water on it. And then she kneaded the meal and clapped the cake out as thin as a sixpence with her hands. But she was only a middling poor baker, one of the sort that used to use a knife to cut the cake of a right round shape. She'd turned the cake twice and taken it off and brushed the griddle with a white goose wing, ready for the next cake, which she was busy cutting round with a knife. Just at that moment, there was heard the sound of something heavy lumbering up to the door. After a few seconds, something fumbled at the snag of the door, and then something knocked high up upon the door, and a voice like the thick, gruff voice of a giant was heard saying,
Open for me!
She made no answer. Again, there was a loud knock, and a big, hoarse voice was heard which cried, "Woman of the house, open for me!" Then the door burst open, and behold, what she would see but a great, big, ugly beast of a began, rushing in and mad with rage. Holding as much as a by your leave, he made one grab at her, and clutched hold of her by the apron, and swung her over his shoulder and away with him. Before she knew where she was, he rushed her across the fields and down the hill till he brought her to the top of Spoot Voer, the big waterfall at Glen May. As the began tore down the hill, the woman felt the ground tremble underneath her feet, and the noise of the waterfall filled her ears. And there in front of her, she saw the stream turn to white spray as it came leaping down from the rocks. As the began swung her into the air to throw her into the deep pool, she thought that the last hour had come. Then all at once, she remembered the knife she held in her hand. Quick as she could think, she cut the string of her apron, and down she tumbled to the ground, rolling over and over down the hill. And before he knew where he was, the began, with speed on him, pitched forward, head first down the rushing Spoot Voer. As he went head over heels and down to the bottom of the pool, with a souse on him you'd have heard half a mile away, she heard a big roar come out of him.
Rumble, rumble, Sambo! I thought I had a lazy dirt, but all I've got in my hand is the edge of the woman's skirt.
And that's the last we seen of that fella.
Now, some people may not be familiar with the Buggane. It was, we are told, or is, a huge menacing ogre, piercing red eyes, terrifying tusks and sharp claws, keeping himself to himself usually in a deserted tholton, that's a ruined solitary cottage, or in a waterfall or a dark forest. But don't disturb this fellow, we are told. Renowned for the destruction that follows him, he's intelligent, cunning, he tears down buildings with his huge bare hands and terrorizes villagers, causing chaos wherever he goes. He will show no mercy to anyone with whom he has a vendetta. On the face of it, he's rather more scary than the Count, but overtly so. The advantage the Count enjoyed was that if you are familiar with tall, pale-skinned men in evening dress, then you probably wouldn't run screaming, as you might do, if the Buggane should look into your kitchen window. So when Hall-Caine and Bram Stoker spoke deep into the night of things that are unnatural, did that grumpy fella, the Buggane, get a mention? So at this darkening time of year, go cautiously when you poke around a tholton or peer under a waterfall, because the division between our world and other worlds is at this season thin and hairy and best left intact.